Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everybody for spending an hour trying to learn about Power Platform. So as Mark has said already, I do work for a consultancy in the UK. I head up Modern Workplace, which essentially is improving the way people work. So we use Office 365 for that. We use security and compliance, but we're also using a lot of Power Platform to help people become more productive, whether that is as a citizen maker or as an application developer. So we work with both sets of people to try and help them use the Power Platform. I do run the London user group for the Power Platform, so if you are interested in learning more, we do run monthly events, so please have a look. And then I also do a podcast every couple of weeks, which is just nattering around technology and the changes that come our way all the time. So what am I going to cover tonight? I'm being quite ambitious tonight. I'm going to try and cover the Power Platform. It is quite large, and this session is kind of keeps growing because Microsoft keep adding more and more things to it. So I am going to do a very quick tour of what makes up the Power Platform as a whole. And I'm also going to go through a little bit about what's on the roadmap. We had a conference, the Microsoft Business Application Summit, about a month ago. They made some quite interesting announcements about what's coming, so I am going to cover some of those as well. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will cover them off at the end of the session. So I guess the first thing is, what's Microsoft's view of the Power Platform? They reckon that there's going to be 500 million apps written in the next 5 years, which is more than has been written in the last 40 years. With that demand, there is going to be a massive need for people to be able to create those, not just developers, but pretty much anybody. And that's really where Microsoft are focusing their attention. They are looking at this Power Platform as a set of tools that enable anybody and everybody to be able to create tools that will help them be more productive in their day-to-day job, but also to service enterprise businesses and develop line of business applications. So they're investing very heavily in it, but they are trying to balance that different set of audiences. So 65% of application development will be in the low code category. You'll hear Power Platform described as low code or no code. And what that really means is that they're trying to appeal to people who, you know, if they know an Excel formula and they can build Excel formulas, they can do really rather a lot in the Power Platform. It's been around for a while, but it is growing massively. 3 million monthly active developers, 700% growth in production apps over a year. You know, the numbers here are phenomenal in terms of the way this platform is taking off. A part of that is around how they've positioned it with that different set of audiences, but also the fact that it can just be used as an individual. I can use it to improve the way I work, the productivity that I have. So I've got, you know, a flow that sends a response to an invite if it doesn't have an agenda, for example, and I can write that. It took about an hour to write. Agreed, I kind of know what I'm doing, but it's not rocket science to write something simple that looks at emails coming into your mailbox. And so this really means that when we're talking about 3 million monthly active developers, they're not developers necessarily who sit in Visual Studio or code in Java. They are actually people in the business who have an opportunity to actually improve the way they work. So what is this platform? What is it made up of? We're familiar with Dynamics, Office 365, Azure. Where the Power Platform sits is, it sits in Azure, but it's tied to your Office 365 tenant, so it uses Active Directory to authenticate you. Dynamics 365, or at least most of the elements, are built on top of the Power Platform. So the core building blocks that we have within the Power Platform, Power BI, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Power BI. It's the big brother of all of them. It's been around the longest, probably has the most maturity. Power Power Apps has been around a fair while now for developing solutions that you can push down quite easily into mobile devices. So it is mobile first. Power Automate. So this one's a little bit of an odd one. It was previously Microsoft Flow. It's now changed to Power Automate. A little bit of a relabeling, a little bit of a rethinking around some of the licensing for it. And the new kid on the block there is Power Virtual Agents, which has basically come out of Dynamics and out of some of the customer service elements of Dynamics. And I'll go through all of these in a bit more detail. But one of the things that this diagram shows is at the bottom there, we've got things like the Common Data Service and data connectors, and AI Builder. Now these are they're all prerequisites for the things above. You know, you can't write a Power BI report without having some data. So whether that comes from the Common Data Service or comes from data connectors, you will have to have something pulling the data in. And then AI Builder is essentially the democratization of cognitive services that we've had for a while in Azure. So think of the Power Platform as lots of different Lego blocks that you can put together and you can make things. But rather than having to, you know, maybe look at Meccano and actually have nuts and bolts and get nitty gritty with it, Lego is much easier to put together. And that's what they're trying to do with the Power Platform. Make it easy for everybody to build solutions that will help them. So if we look at really sort of those core elements and where they sit, they are designed to be integrated. They are designed to be sat in a, I would say an Office 365 tenant, but essentially it's a Dynamics tenant, it's an Office 365 tenant, it's Azure, everything that's controlled by Azure Active Directory as an authentication layer. We can then have the Common Data Service as a data store, and I'll go into more detail about what that actually means. But essentially that's what you consider as internal data, and that can be used to power your Power App, so capturing data, acting on it, interacting with that data in a way that you're actually changing it. Power BI, you are viewing it, you're analyzing it, you're getting the insights from the data. And then Power Automate is very much responding to actions and events. So, you know, you change something in a SharePoint list, in a SQL database, then you can actually trigger an event that will actually trigger Power Automate. So you're really looking at how you automate and orchestrate the transfer of information. And I think it's important to note here that Power Automate, you know, we're not talking about just within the Microsoft realm. Power Automate can connect to Jira, to Twitter, to Facebook. It can connect to pretty much any service. And if there isn't an out-of-the-box connector, one can be written. So it can interface with any REST API. So when they started building the Power Platform, it immediately was something that they wanted to have cross-platform, so mobile first. So thinking about how much time we may have spent over the years building an application that has a SQL backend, it maybe has some business logic in the middle that we've done in C#, and then it has a front end that maybe is using React or Angular to actually present a front end. As soon as anybody then came along and said, yeah, actually, I want to look at that on my iPad, there was a bit of a shudder. There was a bit of a, oh, that's going to be expensive to implement. And I think this is where, you know, everything Power BI, Power Apps, it is all mobile friendly. It is all operating system friendly as well, whether it's on a Mac, whether it's on an Android device, whether it's on a Windows device. All of these tools are designed to be cross-platform, accessible across those platforms, and work seamlessly across them. So where does it actually sit? So if you think about your developers, they may be familiar with Azure, they may be familiar with SQL Server. Power Platform sits on the top and it can integrate with all of those things seamlessly. So we often see that the development space is definitely required when we're talking about Power Platform, because they are there to extend out what it can do. So where I was saying about Power Automate being able to connect to an API, If you don't have an API, you may need your developer to actually build one. So if you have a legacy application, you may need to build an API to allow the automation to take place. That being said, we can also integrate with pretty much any of the Azure services. So if we do want to use the cognitive services, if we want to interact with data using Azure functions, we can do all of that. We see that being used for different reasons. It might be scale, it might be security. It may be that you've got a lot of on-prem solutions that you still need to interact with, and so therefore you need to be writing gateways and things like that. So there are different reasons why we would be extending it out, but fundamentally it means that we have a platform that we can start as a low-code, no-code development, and we can build stuff, and then we can get to a boundary and we can go, actually, we now need to extend this out, and we can start to really integrate with any system that we need to. In terms of the storage that we're using, we can use pretty much any storage that we want to. However, you will hear that most people will be talking, depending on whether they come from a Dynamics background or whether they come from an Office 365 background, Dynamics people will definitely talk about Common Data Service. And this is where we see line of business applications kicking in, where historically we may have gone to SQL and said, great, we've got a relational database, we can store things. If you want to actually start to store different formats of data, then this is where the Common Data Service kicks in. So I'm going to go through what the Common Data Service is, because it is a core building block. So it is a service, so it is built on APIs. We're not interacting with the storage layer directly. We are always going through APIs, and we can access it from Power BI, from Power Apps, Power Automate, AI Builder. So all of those have the built-in connectors to go straight to the APIs that access Common Data Service. We can also develop using Visual Studio. So Visual Studio will allow us to develop. There's an SDK for it to go direct, Xamarin, so it's also accessible to those developers as well. So I guess the first thing about it is that it has built-in authentication and authorization, and that's all based on the initially Azure AD. So the authentication is through Azure AD. The authorization, there are multiple levels of authorization. So you can talk about different environments having different security, and then we can talk about even different entities, so which is analogous to a table. We can have different roles. It's a very, very rich set of authorization permissions that we can put in against entities, and we can go down to say we can create access teams who have different permissions. We can say if you've created things, you have permissions just to the entities that you've created. We can control down to the field level what you can and can't access based on your role, and we also have auditing in there as well. So it is a very, very rich security model that we can put in, and we can apply that again to the logic as well. So we can control some of the logic in terms of workflows, what we apply to different people based on their permission. And when I'm talking about this, the Common Data Service, it tends to be, in most cases, wrapped up through a model-driven app. So there is an interface to manage all of this as well, as opposed to getting into the code to actually manage this. So when we start talking about logic here, we're talking about logic on top of the entities. So applying business rules to say, you know, if I fill in this field with certain values, then this other field might become mandatory. We have things built in like duplicate detection that's quite rich in terms of the role, the fields that we can use, the rules that we can put in there. And we can have automatic calculated fields, roll-up fields, aggregations based on the relationships that we have between those entities. I think it's important to note that when we start to go into what's next in terms of the data, when we talk about the data model, that is a common data model in terms of the semantic layer over the top of the storage layer. So we're not really defining how the data is stored. We're actually leaving that to the service. So we really are saying if we want to store a document, we put it in as a document type, and therefore under the hood, the common data service will say, I will store that in a blob storage, for example. The data validation and the elements like that is applied at the level of the fields as well. So we can do quite rich data manipulation within there. We can define entities as well. They're not third normal form entities, and I would say that as a warning, coming from a database history myself, that's one thing that really got me, is that I'm not talking about third normal form. I'm talking about actually thinking about the functionality and the functional relationship of those entities, and then how that actually gets pushed through into the interface. So I would say that's something to be aware of. If you're looking at the data model and how you map these entities, if you come from a SQL background, those entities, they may not make as much sense to you until you actually really get into the application layer. As I say, the storage, we have any type of storage that's within Azure at our disposal. So it uses Azure SQL, it uses blob storage, it uses file storage, it uses whatever is the most appropriate storage for the field type that we're selecting. So what this means is that we have optimal performance. So rather than forcing large files into a SQL table, for example, we're actually storing it in an appropriate structure that we can retrieve and write to that data really quickly and efficiently. And they do change this sometimes. So under the hood, they will introduce more data types that then make it more efficient. So at times we need to go back and reevaluate maybe the models that we've got, the entities that we've got, and change those to use the new, more efficient way of storing content. And then we've got the integration as well. So everything that takes place within the common data service, we've got triggers that are taking place to trigger webhooks, to trigger events that Power Automate can pick up on. We also have data imports and exports that we can use as well. So we do have data flows that allow us to use Power Query once we've connected to a data source, and that could be using a gateway, but then that allows us to manipulate the data and bring it into the common data service. You might think of that, well, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we just use the data where it sits? So one scenario that we've used this quite extensively is where we may be using data that's actually stored in a transactional system, and we're going to build a solution that's going to augment that capability, and we don't need to write back to that source data, but we need it synchronized into our application. So we can have that as a one-way sync coming through, and that's again an out-of-the-box capability that we can set up, and there are many connectors that we can use, whether it's SQL, whether it's SharePoint, whether it's I can't think of another one off the top of my head, Excel. We can bring that data in and then use it within our common data service. At the other end, there's a one-click export to push the data into Data Lake. So if you do have Data Lake in use, then we can take all of the data out of the common data service, drop it into Data Lake, and then start manipulating it and using it from Data Lake as well. So the common data service as a core component of the Power Platform has a lot of capabilities, and if you do speak to Dynamics people, they will have been using these capabilities for years. This is what Dynamics has been built on, unless they're using finance and operations. If you speak to SharePoint people, they'll look at this and go, I don't really need all of this stuff. And there is an eternal battle between the Office 365 people wanting to use SharePoint and the Dynamics people wanting to use Common Data Service. There are some good reasons to use Common Data Service, and that's based on, I guess, what you can build on it and what you can't build on it. So if you think of Common Data Service as being internal storage for the Power Platform, you can see you've got a column of yeses in can you build on it, whereas the connectors are for everything else. So if I were to come along and build a flow, an automated process, you know, I mentioned one about meeting invites. Well, actually, that's using a connector to go to Outlook and get data that's been sent into my Outlook account, my mailbox in Exchange. I could do that with SharePoint and have a list or a document library in SharePoint. The connectors are essentially pulling data in, but only via the triggers, the events. So I could say I wanted to create a flow, and that starts off every time somebody puts a new document into a SharePoint library. I'm not pulling that information into the Power Platform. I'm just using it as a data source, whereas the Common Data Service is integral in the Power Platform. It's built in so that everything can connect to it. So that's one thing to think about in terms of when you might want to use the Common Data Service as opposed to just using connectors. And there isn't an easy answer to that question. You'll get a lot of different answers. So I'm going to go through what all of these other elements are now. I'm really trying sort of explain to you where they fit, because I think all of these different elements, there's lots of terminology. They tend to all start with the word power, but they all are there to provide different capabilities. So with Canvas apps and Power Apps, so Power Apps, it is an umbrella term. It does cover the three different types of, I'd say, interface, because what these are really trying to do, they're allowing us to surface information, but they're also allowing us to interact with that information and to capture information. So where we have Canvas apps, we're really building an interface that allows us to publish that interface, that app, down to a mobile device. So they are natively able to work on a mobile device. They are also able to work if we embed them into Teams, for example. So we get a difference in the layout, whether it's a portrait or a landscape layout. We can also build them as responsive apps as well, so that it doesn't matter what format we're using. But what we're really doing here is being able to connect, use those connectors and say, actually, we can bring that information in and we can surface it really quite easily. And then we can start interacting with multiple different data sources. So whether it is multiple entities in CDS, whether it's multiple lists within SharePoint, or whether it's a combination. Maybe it's, I want to look at a list in SharePoint and I can act on that, and maybe I could publish a tweet or post a message into Teams. I can do all of those things from within a Canvas app and have a mobile app interface that I can use. When we start to get to the model-driven apps, we have to use CDS. We have to have that common data service data storage underneath it, and it gives us more scale and performance than we would get out of the box with the Canvas apps. So when we're looking at line of business applications that somebody might be living in, day out, the model-driven apps are really where we start, because they are going to be able to scale, and they have the built-in capability to surface information based on the relationships between those different entities. So we can build these apps. Again, we have a WYSIWYG designer that we can use to drag and drop everything into the model-driven apps. So it's more like configuring the interface than building the interface. So once we have our entities, we can configure how we want to see them. We can configure different views, choose which columns we're going to see, apply filters, and apply security. So it's a very, very convenient way to build quite sophisticated apps and a sophisticated interface. And then the third one that we have there is the portals. So sometimes called Power Apps portals. And this has really come from the dynamic side of things, where you want to be able to have members of the public or B2B engagement, and you want people to maybe sign in using LinkedIn or Twitter and then interact with data that's related to them. So we can use those different authentication tools to allow people to essentially create accounts and then interact with our data. So whether that is for a council and you're reporting that a street light's not working, whether that's a tenant in a housing association reporting a tap that's not working, the Power Apps portals will work very well for that. We also see them being used for a lot of marketing events when you want to have public interaction. So where the Canvas apps and the model-driven apps are really designed for internal usage, they are protected by our Azure AD. The portals, we can start to use other authentication methods to allow people into them. In terms of guest users, Canvas apps can be shared with guest users, but it's not necessarily the best interface for them at the moment. So I'd say that's something that's coming. But if you are thinking about external use, then portals should be the first step that you go to. So thinking about Power Automate, now it used to be called Flow. A lot of people still call it Flow. Power Automate, the difference between what was Microsoft Flow and Power Automate is that Power Automate is an umbrella term. Like Power Apps has those 3 different flavors of app, Power Automate has actually 3 different flavors of automation tool. So it has Flow, and I will continue to call it Flow because that's essentially what it is. It's exactly the same tool that we had before. It is a design canvas that allows you to build processes that have a trigger point, so an event that takes place that then kicks off a whole bunch of different activities or actions. And we can put, as you can see in there, you can put conditional logic in, we can put weights in there, approval processes, we can interact with different data sources as well. So in the same way that we were talking about those connectors before, we can bring together lots of different types of flow connectors into one place. So if I wanted a trigger to be a new document being created in SharePoint, I could write a message to Teams, I could ask for an approval process, but look up managers or the hierarchy to find the person who needs to approve it. I could then even write a ticket to Jira to say we need to address this, or post something out on Twitter. It is an orchestration tool that allows us to bring all of these different connectors together. Now, that being said, there is governance that we can put in place to actually prevent some of those connectors being in the same flow. So there are data loss prevention policies that we can use to actually categorize those connectors and say, actually, it's great that we can use them all, but I don't want my SharePoint data in the same flow as a Twitter connector, for example. So we can actually block those and make sure that we don't have those social connectors being run in the same flows as we got our business data. The one on the right there, the business process flow, this one is only available within the Common Data Service and within the model-driven apps. And this is very much a state-driven process where we can say we have a life cycle for this entity and we are going to do things or get extra information when it moves from state to state. So the common way that if you've ever seen customer service, customer engagement in Dynamics, opportunities will go through a very defined life cycle, and every time you go through into the next state, you'll be asked to make sure that you've put extra information in. So it might be, when is this opportunity closing? If I haven't put that in, I can't move it on to the next state. And so these business process flows are really useful for managing the data that's being captured and ensuring that you've got the integrity of your data before moving on to the next state. Now, you can also put in branching in here as well. So we can choose different reasons for doing things and react differently depending on those reasons. The business process flows also allow for the evolution of entities. So if, for example, we created a lead where we say, well, we know this person's interested in something that we're doing, but then we want to change that lead and say, well, actually, we've qualified them, we've spoken with them, we know that this is actually an opportunity. We can change that lead into an opportunity using the same business process flow. So it has a lot of benefits for when we're working with the entities within the common data service. And we can also bring that information back out quite easily as well. So we can surface it in Canvas apps as well. So in some scenarios, we see clients who want a simplistic interface over really complex logic. So we'll have the common data service, but we might wrap it in a Canvas app and make it more easily accessible to users. And that means that we can actually reduce down what they see, so it's more focused as well. The final thing I'll just say about the business process flows is that we can have multiple business process flows attached to an entity. So we can do that based on permissions. So a user might do something, but their manager may be able to do more things, and we can control that through the permissions. So whilst the user might not be able to cancel a process, a manager may be able to cancel a process. So it's very useful for having that added security model in place around how we manage entities. So the next one I have is Power BI. Now, I'm pretty sure, seeing as this is past, that most of you are probably familiar with Power BI. It's been around a long time. It's very mature now in terms of how it works, and we now have things like the decomposition tree coming into it. So it's a very rich tool that we see a lot of clients using really very effectively now. And I think what we're starting to see though is people are starting to look at Power BI and say, actually, it's great. Now, how can I act on that data? And I think that's one of the things that the Power Platform is giving us is actually we can trigger flows from actions that are taken in Power BI. We can embed Power Apps into Power BI and vice versa. We can bring Power BI into a Canvas app so that we can actually interact with it there and then. We can also bring Power BI into a model-driven app and give us contextual information so that we can see our insights from Power BI and act on it in the same interface. I think this is really where we're starting to see a lot of the capabilities that we may have had to develop as custom capabilities are now out of the box in terms of how we can integrate them. I think there's some other changes that for Power BI that are coming through is integration with the security models. So being able to have data loss prevention and classifications coming into Power BI so that you can then say, if I'm going to download an Excel file from it, it's going to have that same classification as the source data. Those sorts of things I think will make it continue to make Power BI an incredibly useful tool that most organizations, it's a no-brainer for them to invest in. I think the thing about Power BI when you're looking at the Power Platform that's really interesting is where we see clients who maybe have those transactional systems and they want to bring information in and then augment it. When we start to talk to them about how the Power Platform and the Common Data Service fits in with things like data lake, exports to SQL, imports from SQL, they start to see it in a different way in terms of how they can build up reports and then publish those data sets out. So being aware of where the data sits is increasingly important so that you know actually where that data is actually being manipulated from, especially when it comes to some of that data that's maybe in Common Data Service, as opposed to just being in a data warehouse where it may have historically been sat for reporting purposes. So the next one I want to talk about is the Power Virtual Agents. Now, as I say, this is a new kid on the block in terms of as a member of the Power Platform family, but it's been around in various guises throughout the Microsoft stack. And it's really where we see the Power Virtual Agent slotting in is where we have essentially dialogues that we want to design and where we want to have maybe, so working with a university at the moment, they get a lot of questions, you know, especially now, what's going on with COVID? Am I going to be able to go on campus? The bots can really answer the questions by designing topics that allow us to say, we have a question that's going to trigger our conversation, and then we might want to refine it. So we can put in options, and we can do that against particular entities. So we can define entities to say, these are the options that I think you might be looking for. And then based on what the user selects, we can respond appropriately. Now, one of the advantages of this is that it allows us to have lots of topics that we can actually have people manage. And because the interface is relatively simple, that doesn't need to be a developer. That doesn't need to be somebody sat in a back room looking at the bot framework or some of the more sophisticated elements. This can be essentially the same as a content editor who might be looking at the FAQ pages on a public website or an intranet. And they can actually work through this and set this up very effectively. And we've seen this happen with organizations where they look at this and they go, that just makes sense. It's quicker to build it than it is to design it and talk about it. The power of the Power Virtual Agent, though, is that it is extensible. So we can trigger authentication so that it knows who you are. It knows actually you're in that particular department. This is who you are in the organization. And it can also use flow. So we can trigger flow based on a dialogue to say, right, well, go off and get me the name of the manager. Go off and get me information about this user's inbox or the tasks that they have assigned to them. So we can use it to actually bring information back and use that information in a more dynamic dialogue. We can publish the Power Virtual Agents in multiple ways as well. So where we've got this screen and it's showing a dialogue and it's showing on the left-hand side how we can step through that dialogue. Actually, we can publish that to Teams. So it can be, you know, a chat in Teams. We can embed it on a page. We can put it directly into things like Facebook if we want to. So depending how you want to use this, we can surface this information in terms of the content for these dialogues, these conversations, into multiple different formats, which again makes for a very compelling story where otherwise you might have been saying, oh, I need to manually write an interface to integrate with Teams. I need to manually write an interface to integrate with my website. This can do it all in one way, just through publishing it. Obviously, if you've got lots of topics, you may want to know what's popular, what's not popular, where people are dropping out. So what we have on the right in this picture is the analytics. So we can see how people are dropping out of the process and then identify where we might need to address the content that is in there so that we can actually provide better answers. So we can do that with the analytics as well. And it does have a customer satisfaction capability as well, where we can ask people every time, how did I answer your question? So we can get some really good insights as to how effectively the solution is actually providing answers to our audience. So the next one is AI Builder. Now, AI Builder is really trying to bring all of the cognitive services into an easily accessible interface. So being able to allow us, rather than having to, you know, hook into a web request and say, right, I need to send this information through to this service and then analyze the return. This is trying to make it easier so that things like business card reader, we can write a Power app, a Canvas app that takes a picture on the phone, and then we can just take that image and we can just send it straight through into business card reader and it will send back the results. So it's very much making it easier for us to use AI and to use the cognitive services that essentially have been there for a while and are being rolled out in more and more ways throughout certainly throughout the Microsoft 365 stack, the Office 365 interfaces, you know, Office. We're seeing more and more of these tools being used. AI Builder makes it easier for us to use them within the context of the Power Platform. So some of the ways that we've seen this used, if you are a field agent and you're taking a picture of a shelf in a retail context and you want to see how many items there are on that shelf, we can use AI Builder to build that. Sentiment analysis has been around for ages. This will make it easier for us to say, well, we've put data in, maybe into our common data service. Now we're going to automate the process for getting that sentiment analysis so that when we look at that information, we already have the hard work done for us. And now we're starting to really get prediction models as well. So bringing the machine learning in and being able to say, actually, based on the information that we've got, we can build models, we can train those models as well. And we can understand how effectively they're working based on the diagnostics that we've got here as well. So we're really starting to see AI Builder come to the fore as a tool that is just something that we can just add in to the processes that we're using, rather than something that you need a degree in data science to be able to use. So that's a very quick introduction to what is there in the Power Platform. Actually, I've just realized I've forgotten one thing, which was back in under Power Automate, the UI flows. So this is again, a new kid on the block. UI flows are there to do that RPA, the robotic process automation. So where you have an interface that you can't automate or you can't hook flow into, you can actually start to record, like recording a macro, record the actions that you're taking on a screen so that you can then use that as part of a process, and you can maybe take information from your Canvas app but actually push it into a UI flow that will actually start up a session on a virtual machine, enter the data for you as if you were typing it in, and then save it. So that kind of RPA process is the other one that is coming along, and Microsoft are putting a lot of work into that at the moment. Right now, I think I've finished for what's there at the moment. It is a lot. There's a lot of different capabilities in here, and based on the expectation that there's going to be 500 million new apps in the next 5 years, there's a lot of investment going into all sorts of different areas of the Power Platform. I would say that it's one of those things that it is a platform. None of us are going to be experts in all of it. We all will have our areas that we are more interested in. So it is something that's, yeah, there are areas that we're all going to be interested in, but none of us are going to know all of it. So that is something to be aware of. If anybody ever asks you, are you the Power Platform expert? You might know the words, but you won't be able to do it all. So with that, I want to go through some of the changes that are coming. So as I say, the Microsoft Business Application Summit was about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and then we had Build after that. Both of those announced some quite interesting changes that are coming, and I've picked out a few of them that I wanted to just talk through. So one of them is direct query support for CDS in Power BI. Now, at the moment, if you use Power BI and you report on CDS, you can get the data in, but you can't do a direct query. So you need to think about the security that's going to take place there. But also you need to think about the refresh, because it won't be real time. So one of the things with this direct query support is that we're going to be able to actually query this common data service using SQL Server, so using Management Studio, and we'll be able to query it using T-SQL. Entity Framework will work as well, but because we're using the service endpoints, all of the security is in place. So whether that is that I'm not allowed to see particular entities, particular records, or particular fields, all of that will be built into what comes back when I'm using my identity to actually use T-SQL to query the common data service. So I think that will be quite a game changer when we're looking at some of the Power BI reports that might be built on top of the common data service. And also when we're trying to just execute queries and interrogate the data. So this was a really quite substantial change that we're expecting during the summer. So yeah, real-time updates and the security just works. It is going to be quite interesting to see how much of this actually comes through in terms of things like views and stored procedures. I don't think those will be supported, but it will be there for query purposes to allow us to pull this information directly into our Power BI reports and essentially any other system that we can use a SQL query on. So some of the Power BI enhancements, I think visualizing the personal visualization will be really interesting, to be able to make changes to say this is my view and I want to save that view as my own view. That will be something I think a lot of people have been asking for. The mobile report authoring, I'll be honest, I'm not sure how many people are going to look at this and say this is really useful, because I don't know how many people you currently use mobile devices to look at Power BI. But if they're not, this will be a game changer, because we'll be able to tailor the reports to make use of the format for mobile devices. So rather than assuming that the responsiveness will just come based on what Microsoft are deciding, we can actually start to prioritize and say, actually, this is a better set of views that we want to see if you are using a mobile device. So I think this will be very much a change for Power BI and how it's used on mobile devices. Smart narratives, so being able to put in more information. I think this has always been something that people want to be able to put in. They want to annotate the data. They want to be able to put in information that allows you to add just that little bit more context to what you're seeing. So I think this will really come into its own when we start to see complex data, and it's adding to that two-way interaction with the Power BI content. So it really will add to what we can do with Power BI. So that is a very, very quick tour of the Power Platform. And I think just to recap, there are lots of moving parts in the Power Platform. There are lots of components. This picture is quite a common one, but it is quite a simplistic one, because we know Power BI has a lot of capabilities. It's got a lot of different data sources, the manipulation, the load of data, lots of different capabilities there. We know Power Apps. We now know it's got 3 different types of interface underneath that. So we've got the Canvas app, we've got the model-driven app, and we've got the Power Portals. Power Automate, again, an umbrella term. We've got the flows under there. We've got the UI flows, that robotic process automation, and then we've got those business process flows as well. Power Virtual Agents, so that chat interface, that dialogue, the ability to interact with the flows. We will have the ability to interact with the bot framework, which is the developer side of it as well. So again, a lot of capabilities all rolled up into one term. And then underneath that, we've got the Common Data Service, which, I'll be honest, it probably has the most sophisticated security model of anything that I've used. And it does allow for all of the other services to be built on top of it as well. We've got the data connectors to allow us to connect to quite literally hundreds of different data sources to trigger events, to trigger actions from those data sources, and to build our own custom connectors if one doesn't already exist. And then we have AI Builder, bringing that AI capability, those cognitive services, bringing them to the fore, making it easier for them to be used by low-code and no-code developers as they build Power Platform solutions. So there's a lot in there. I think what I would say is there's a lot of different sources. So we do have powerplatformug.com. So there's a lot of Power Platform user groups around the world. And certainly this coming Thursday, I'm going into the model-driven apps in more detail at a user group, the East Midlands user group. The other thing that's going on in that one is working even better in teams. So teams and Power Platform go together. If you do want to know more about how all of these really work, Microsoft are very keen with these app in a day, or the in a day series. So the app in a day will cover, it's a hands-on day for you to actually really get used to using Canvas apps, Power Apps within the model-driven apps, dashboard in a day for Power BI, the new one, PVA, so the Power Virtual Agent in a day, and then admin in a day as well for understanding more about the data loss prevention, the security, the administration of the Power Platform as a whole within your organization. So I guess with that, I'm just going to go back to this one. And are there any questions that have come up during that?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Alan. I've got a bunch of questions here. So we'll start from the top. You mentioned at the beginning of the session about the numerous amount of connectors out of the box that you can use, and you also said that if there's not one that you will require there to connect to something, you can write your own. So how would you go about writing your own?
So essentially, it depends on what you need to do. So there's a few different options there. So if you have a web API, then you can connect to it using a custom connector. And what you take is you take a Swagger file to define your REST API, and then you basically use that, and you can build a custom connector based on that definition. So a common scenario that we come up against is if you're working with the Microsoft Graph, there isn't a connector for the Microsoft Graph. It needs an awful lot of different permissions and things to say, you know, are you going to use Azure AD, or what elements do you want to connect to? But you can take a Swagger definition of some of those elements, and you can create a custom connector. It'll take you half hour, if that. And what that will then define is the actions that you're using, and that way you can use it as a connector in your in the Power Platform. So whether you're connecting to it from Flow within Power Automate or directly from Power Apps, you can then use that and interact with it in the same way that you would a normal out of the box connector.
Okay, cool. Next question. So have you got a good way to deploy Power Platform solutions? Because there doesn't seem to be one single mechanism to do this. Examples in point are Power BI and Logic apps.
So calling out two elements that are slightly different, but yes. So what I would say is, yes, so we do a lot of work with Azure DevOps and build pipelines around the Power Platform. That is coming to Power BI. So they are, I can't remember whether it's in general availability yet or not, but they are bringing build pipelines for Power BI.
Cool.
So that was announced at Build or MBAS. So that's quite a new one. That might be towards the end of the summer when that comes out. So keep an eye open for that. The other, so Azure Functions was the other one. So if you were using Azure DevOps and you have build pipelines, then you can use you know, the ARM templates to deploy Azure Functions. For pretty much all of the rest of it, the Common Data Service supports solutions. So there's a whole ALM piece in there around deploying solutions and solution layering, and you can put your flows in there, you can put your Common Data Service entities, you can put your Canvas apps, business process flows, Power Virtual Agents. They can all be put into solutions that can be deployed within the Power Platform. It is an area that is being worked on. It's it's getting there. I will say it's not perfect, but you can certainly get a lot of robustness around how you deploy these solutions into the Power Platform. They do talk about managed and unmanaged solutions, so there might be some terminology around them that is not necessarily familiar to most people, but you can use build pipelines to pull them down, put them into DevOps. And so where you've got lots of UI elements of the model-driven apps to build them and the Canvas apps, there are pipelines that will pull that stuff down, put it into DevOps, then package it up as what's called a managed solution so that it can't be changed, and then you can deploy that into your production environment. So yes, there is a good ALM story coming together around all of this.
Excellent. So this is my stupid question here. What is the difference between a Logic app and a Power app?
Very good question. So I will give you a simple answer. The Logic app is an Azure service, so it's hosted in Azure and it is paid for differently. So you are paying for either on execution of the Logic app or on an app service plan if it's a larger, well-used Logic app. Think of Logic apps as being more high volume, centralized management, more in the dev space than the flows that sit within Power Automate, because it's the same design surface that you'll be using, and you can actually export a flow into a Logic app. So you can actually kind of take it from the citizen developer space and say, actually, this is being used extensively, but we want to have more control over it from an enterprise IT perspective, and therefore we can put it up into a Logic app. There are different capabilities as well with them. So it used to be that the big difference was that you didn't have approvals in Logic apps, but you do have them now. But Logic apps can hook into all of the Azure capabilities more easily. So we see them being used in slightly different ways. So you might have webhooks going to Logic apps rather than going to a flow, because it's easier to have that central point and then be running Azure runbooks off that, for example.
Okay, cool. So do you foresee edge computing products such as SQL Edge promote the use of the Power Platform, and what parts of the Power Platform can run without internet connectivity? So for instance, can Canvas apps run without internet connectivity?
Yep, so Canvas apps can run without internet connectivity, so they can run offline. So you can run them on your mobile device, and if you're offline, yes, they will work. It takes forethought and design to really make them work properly. Model-driven apps will also, so they will have an offline capability coming autumn, I think, so they can run offline. But yes, we do work with clients who use Canvas apps on mobile devices. They essentially cache the data on the device. They can be in a factory, they can be actually out on boats and things, and not have internet connectivity. It will store the information within the device, and then when it connects again, it will synchronize that data back up. So those capabilities have been there for a while. They are in the process of improving those as well.
So talking about the edge thing there, so do you really see a need for something like SQL Edge, like a localized mobile database at all for this kind of stuff?
I think it would depend on a few things. So you will have, if you're using a Canvas app on a phone, you have limited storage capacity. So you may find that you are limited in how much you can download and how much you can create whilst being offline. I don't know off the top of my head how you would necessarily use Edge SQL. So I'm thinking about, boats, ferries. If you're on a ferry, or a cruiser, then you might have a SQL database, but you need your Power App to connect to it. And whilst you're wandering around, you want your Power App to connect to it. You would probably need to use, I'd need to think about that one in terms of how you would get it to that local storage, as opposed to using Flow, which I don't believe will work offline. So I think that there are limitations, and that might be a use case where you actually look at it and say, actually, maybe it isn't the right solution. I'd have to think about that one and see whether I can think of a solution for that one.
Okay, cool. I've got a set of questions here which kind of relate to the same thing. The first is, I'll ask both of them, I think, but it's all related to CDS. So the first one is, sorry, I just got to find it. And I've lost it now. That's typical, isn't it? Right, I'll ask the first one. Hopefully the second one will appear. Yeah, do you load data up into the CDS? This is a little unclear to me.
So you can do. So CDS is data storage. So if you have an application that you build, you can load data into it, so you can pre-populate it, but then you don't need to be synchronizing data into it. It will just run on its own. So you can think of it as a standalone database that you would start to populate as your application is running. What I was talking about with the data flows and importing data and synchronizing data in is, yes, you can use other data sources to seed the common data service. So, for example, I'm working with a university. They've got a student management system. I'm building an application that needs some data around those students, but I'm going to be creating a whole lot of different data that is nothing to do with the student management system and doesn't need to be in there. So I've got a synchronization process that's syncing up the student data, and then I can build on that data and use that data as the core data that I'm using for students, for authentication, etc. But I don't need to write anything back. I'm just using that to say, if the student leaves, I get an update and the data disappears. So it's more of that integration rather than it being a mandatory thing to actually populate the common data service up front.
Okay, cool.
Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. Okay, so I can't find the other question, but it was really the other question was really trying to understand the CDS. So final question, I think. I believe that the beginner exam for the Power Platform is PL 900. I don't know if it's still in beta. Have you got any tips?
PL 900 is the fundamentals exam, I believe, and that one I think it's out of beta now. And if you do I think there's the learning pathways on the Microsoft Learn site. It's very good. You need an overview of the building blocks of the Power Platform. You don't need to be an expert in actually building things. It's more around understanding when you would use the different tools. So understanding, when you would use a business process flow as opposed to a flow. So just understanding the core reasons behind essentially the elements that I've talked through today. It is a fundamentals exam, so it is a relatively high level. You don't need to be an in-depth expert. They are releasing a new one, PL 100, I want to say, which is more of a maker exam, and that's for building Canvas apps essentially. So for that one, you'll need to be more hands-on actually building.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll wrap the session up there. Thank you very much, Alan, for joining us. It's been really, really entertaining and educational. I've learned a few things, believe it or not. And thank you everyone else for joining.